It was a Tuesday evening, bland and routine. My wife, Rebecca, a corporate compliance auditor, was working on her laptop. The apartment smelled like Thai takeout and safety. 4 years of marriage, 4 years of normalcy. Then she spoke, without looking up. "Hey, so I opened a business credit line using your name." No apology, no hesitation. She said it like she'd bought groceries. I stared. My wife, who audits ethical violations for a living, had just confessed to identity fraud against her own husband. She saw an elegant solution. I saw a legal time bomb. My heart hammered, but I locked down my expression. Years of corporate maneuvering kicked in. Never show the play. "Interesting," I replied, my voice dangerously light. Satisfied, she went back to her spreadsheets. She thought I'd approve. I stood, the tremor in my hands cold and calculating. I walked to my office, closed the door softly, and opened my laptop. The panic was absent. It was replaced by a devastating clinical clarity. I wasn't calling a lawyer yet. I was pulling documents and building a timeline. She had treated our marriage like a spreadsheet to be manipulated. I was about to perform the final unforgiving audit. Late September Tuesday, the background hum of safety in our apartment was shattered by 3 words. My wife, Rebecca, a high-level financial compliance auditor, confessed, "I opened a business credit line using your name." The admission of identity fraud was delivered with 0 remorse, just the casual efficiency of someone checking off a chore. She needed flexibility because her own credit was maxed. She was proud of her solution. I was stunned, but instantly cold. This wasn't a domestic issue. It was a catastrophic legal breach orchestrated by the one person whose job was to prevent it. I didn't yell or panic. I used the corporate reflex: observe, calculate, conceal. "Interesting," was all I offered, freezing her expectation for a fight. She went back to her laptop, complacent. I rose, feeling a dangerous clarity replace the shock. I retreated to my office, closing the door on the domestic scene. My hands were shaking not with fear, but with the focused energy of a man preparing for war. I opened my private documents, not to confront her, but to quantify my legal and financial exposure. She used my identity to solve her problem. Now, I would use her confession to solve mine. The marriage audit was officially underway. Before we go any further, don't forget to like and subscribe, and hit hype to boost this episode. Drop a comment below with your city or country. I'm always curious where viewers are joining from. This story gets darker than you might expect, so stick with me. There are twists you won't see coming. Now let's get back to it. We were together 6 years, married 4. Our foundation was built on one principle, derived from past failed relationships: financial independence. We never merged finances. We split every bill, rent, utilities, groceries, with mathematical, religious precision using a shared spreadsheet. Our explicit, non-negotiable agreement was separate accounts, separate credit, no unilateral decisions about money. Everything had to be transparent, discussed, and equal. This agreement, I now realized, was only a boundary to me. Rebecca was a compliance auditor at Meridian Financial Group. Her career was dedicated to finding and prosecuting ethical violations, fraud, and identity theft. She knew the federal statutes by heart. She knew exactly which lines not to cross. Yet, to fund her growing freelance consulting work, a side business I fully supported, bringing in an extra 30 or 40K a year, she crossed the most critical line. She didn't ask, she didn't hint. She simply assumed that because we were married, my social security number, my credit, and my legal identity were hers to borrow, like a sweater. That casual, arrogant assumption revealed the truth. She didn't see me as a partner with autonomy. She saw me as a resource to be accessed when hers failed. As I sat in my office with her confession echoing, the compliance expert committing fraud against her own partner, the irony was a sharp, devastating realization. The foundation of our relationship, built on carefully maintained separateness, had been unilaterally destroyed by the one person sworn to uphold ethical lines. Our 6-year relationship, 4 years of marriage, was defined by one rigid rule established after past financial disasters: absolute financial separation. We maintained individual accounts, meticulously split every expense via a shared spreadsheet, and strictly kept our credit histories separate. This wasn't mistrust, it was mutual respect for legal and financial autonomy. The irony of the confession was devastating. Rebecca worked in compliance for a major financial firm, her job being to investigate and prosecute the very crimes she just committed: fraud and unauthorized account access. She knew the law better than anyone. For 18 months, I had enthusiastically supported her side consulting business, which was generating substantial extra income. But her entrepreneurial spirit had a fatal flaw. When her credit maxed out, she didn't consult me. She simply used my identity, my name, my SSN, my credit, to open a business line. Her casual, "I opened a credit line using your name," exposed the terrifying truth. Despite our years of mathematical precision, she saw our marriage not as a partnership of equals, but as a unit where my legal identity was a resource she could unilaterally access when convenient. She treated my legal standing like a tool from my closet. That assumption dissolved every boundary we had built. The marriage, founded on transparency and separation, was fatally undermined by the one person whose profession was to ensure ethical conduct. I didn't confront her that night. I needed time to think, to process, to understand the full scope of what she'd done and what it meant for both of us. More importantly, I needed information first. Hard facts, documentation, evidence. Accusations without evidence are just noise. They're emotional outbursts that can be dismissed or deflected or turned back against you. But accusations with ironclad documentation? Those are weapons. So the next morning, over coffee at the kitchen table, I asked her to explain it to me calmly and in detail. I kept my tone curious rather than accusatory, interested rather than angry. I wanted her to believe we were just having a conversation, just clarifying some details about her business operations. Nothing more serious than that. "Walk me through what you did," I said, wrapping my hands around my coffee mug and looking at her with what I hoped was an expression of genuine curiosity. "I just want to understand how this works, the mechanics of it." She seemed relieved that I wasn't angry, that I hadn't spent the entire night stewing about her confession and building up resentment. She probably thought I was coming around, that I was interested in her business, that maybe I'd even be proud of her resourcefulness and entrepreneurial creativity. She had no idea she was digging her own grave. "Okay, so," she started, setting down her coffee mug and leaning forward slightly with the enthusiasm of someone explaining a clever solution to a complex problem. "About 4 months ago, maybe closer to 5 months actually, it might have been late April or early May, I needed a business credit line to smooth out cash flow issues. Some of my clients pay on net 30 or net 60 terms, which means I have to cover expenses for weeks or even months before I actually get paid. Software subscriptions, contractor payments when I need to outsource work, marketing costs for the website and advertising, office supplies, professional development courses, all of that adds up fast. And my personal credit was already pretty much maxed out from the car loan and some old student debt that I'm still paying down, so I couldn't qualify for a business line on my own. The banks kept rejecting my applications because my debt-to-income ratio was too high. "So you used mine," I said neutrally, not making it a question. "Right, exactly. I used your information, your social security number, your income documentation from your W-2s that we use for our joint tax return, your credit score, which is significantly better than mine. I figured it wouldn't be a problem because I'm making all the payments on time, every single payment, never missed one. You're not affected at all. Your credit score hasn't changed. There's been no negative impact on you whatsoever. If anything, it's probably helping your credit because it's adding another account with perfect payment history." I nodded slowly, processing the information, calculating how many laws she'd just admitted to breaking in that single paragraph. "And you didn't think to ask me first? To run it by me before you submitted the application?" She hesitated then, and I watched something flicker across her face. It was subtle, a slight tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible shift in her expression, but I'd been with her long enough to recognize it. It was calculation. She was deciding how much honesty was safe, how much truth I could handle, what version of events would be most likely to secure my cooperation and forgiveness. Then she shrugged, and the mask of casual confidence slid back into place. "Honestly, I didn't think you'd mind. We're married. We're a team. What's mine is yours. What's yours is mine. That's literally what we said in our wedding vows, remember? The whole in prosperity and adversity part. I was going to tell you eventually, obviously, but I wanted to make sure everything was running smoothly first. I didn't want to bother you with administrative details if it ended up being temporary or if I paid it off quickly. You're busy with work. You've got that big project with the hospital system that's been consuming all your time. I didn't want to add more stress to your plate with financial details that didn't really affect you." There it was, the justification, the reframing, the careful linguistic construction that transformed fraud into consideration, that turned a crime into an act of spousal thoughtfulness. She didn't see it as identity theft. She didn't see it as fraud. She saw it as a shortcut, a practical solution to a cash flow problem, a creative workaround to an obstacle that was preventing her business from growing. And because we were married, because she believed in some version of shared identity that existed only in her mind and had no basis in actual law, she felt entitled to take that shortcut without my consent, without my knowledge, without my participation in the decision. She thought marriage meant permission. She thought the vows we'd exchanged gave her carte blanche to use my identity however she saw fit. I asked her more questions, keeping my tone neutral and curious, like a journalist conducting an interview rather than a prosecutor building a case. Which lender did you use? How much was the credit line approved for? When exactly did you open it? What documents did you have to submit? How did you forge my signature? Did you use DocuSign or physical paperwork? What address did you list? Did you have to provide income verification? She answered everything freely, even enthusiastically. She pulled up the account on her laptop to show me the dashboard, the payment history, the current balance. She walked me through the application process step by step, explaining how she'd accessed my tax documents from our shared filing cabinet, how she'd used my email address to create the account, and then immediately changed the notification settings so that all correspondence would go only to her email, how she'd practiced my signature a few times on scratch paper before submitting the digital authorization form. She thought honesty, after the fact, would earn her forgiveness. She thought that by being transparent now, by showing me that she'd been responsible with the account and had made every payment on time, she could undo the violation. She could make it okay retroactively. The credit line was for $50,000. She'd drawn down about $18,000 so far. The interest rate was 8.9%, which was apparently quite good for a business line of credit. The monthly payments were around $400, and she'd never missed one. Everything was current, just like she'd said. I took screenshots of everything on my phone while she was showing me the account. I made detailed notes in a new document, dates, amounts, lender name, it was called Velocity Capital Partners, account numbers, routing numbers, payment history. She watched me do it, probably thinking I was just being thorough, maybe even impressed by her business acumen and organizational skills. She had absolutely no idea that I was building a criminal case against her. I saved everything. I backed it up to the cloud. I created a password-protected folder on my laptop with copies of all the screenshots and all my notes. And then I smiled at her and said, "Thanks for explaining. That actually makes sense. I appreciate you being upfront about it." She smiled back, relieved. Crisis averted, she probably thought. Problem solved. Marriage intact. I didn't yell at her. I didn't threaten divorce. I didn't tell her she'd betrayed my trust or launch into a lecture about ethics and legal boundaries and the difference between partnership and property. I just asked for more clarification, for complete documentation. "Can you forward me all the paperwork?" I said that evening while we were sitting on the couch watching some mindless sitcom. The original application, the approval emails, the monthly statements, the payment confirmations, everything related to the account? She looked surprised, pausing the show and turning to look at me. "Why do you need all that?" "Because it's my name on the account," I said reasonably, keeping my voice calm and practical. "I should know exactly what I'm supposedly responsible for. If something goes wrong down the line, if you miss a payment, or if there's a dispute with the lender, or if you default for some reason, it's my credit on the line, right? It's my legal liability. I need to have complete records of everything so I can track it properly, just for my own peace of mind." She nodded, and I could see the relief flooding through her body language. This made sense to her. This was reasonable. This was exactly the kind of thorough, organized thing I would naturally want to do. "Yeah, that's fair. That's actually really smart. I should have thought of that myself. I'll forward you everything tonight after dinner." And she did. That same evening, around 9 o'clock, while we were both in bed reading, her with some mystery novel she'd been working through, me with a collection of essays about corporate culture, I heard the notification chime on my phone. Email from Rebecca, and subject line, credit line docs, full file. I opened it, my heart rate accelerating slightly despite my efforts to stay calm. She'd forwarded me everything, absolutely everything. The original application with my information filled in, my name, my social security number, my date of birth, my employment information, my annual income. The authorization forms with my forged digital signature, the approval letter from Velocity Capital Partners, the account opening documents, the terms and conditions, every single monthly statement since the account had been opened in May, every payment confirmation, the automatic payment setup showing transfers from her business checking account. It was all there, a perfect, comprehensive, meticulously organized paper trail of fraud. She'd handed it to me gift-wrapped with a bow on top. I downloaded everything to my secure folder. I printed physical copies of the key documents on our home printer the next morning while she was in the shower. I organized it all chronologically in a 3-ring binder, using those plastic sheet protectors to keep everything pristine. I labeled everything with dates and document types. I created a summary document outlining the timeline and key details. I prepared it exactly the way I would prepare documentation for a legal proceeding, because that's exactly what it was going to become. Here's what I want to be absolutely clear about, because this is important. I didn't do this out of spite. I didn't do it to destroy her or to get revenge for some perceived betrayal. I didn't do it because I was angry, or because I wanted to punish her, or because I took some sick pleasure in watching her career implode. I did it because what she did was illegal, and I had no legal, moral, or ethical obligation to protect her from the consequences of her own deliberate choices. Let me explain the law here, because it matters. What Rebecca did, opening a credit account using another person's identity without their knowledge or consent, is identity theft under federal law. Specifically, it's a violation of 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 1028, which criminalizes identity fraud and identity theft. It doesn't matter that we were married. It doesn't matter that she was making the payments on time. It doesn't matter that my credit score wasn't negatively affected. None of that matters under the law. What matters is consent, and I never gave consent. The fact that she worked in compliance made it worse, not better. She knew the law. She knew it intimately. She'd personally participated in investigations at Meridian where employees were terminated and prosecuted for violations that were arguably less serious than what she'd done. She'd sat in meetings where the company's legal team had explained, in excruciating detail, exactly what constituted fraud and identity theft, and unauthorized access to personal information. She knew, and she chose to break those rules anyway, using my identity as the vehicle for her crime. That wasn't just a betrayal of trust. That wasn't just a marital problem that could be solved through couples counseling or a difficult conversation or a promise to do better. It was a crime. A federal crime, actually, and I was the victim. So I did what any victim should do. I reported it. But here's where it gets interesting, where the strategy comes in. I didn't just file a police report or contact the FBI or notify the credit bureaus. Those were all options, certainly, and I considered them carefully. But I did something more strategic. Something that would have immediate and devastating consequences for Rebecca in ways that criminal charges would take months or years to achieve. I reported it directly to her employer's compliance department. Think about that for a moment. Rebecca worked in compliance at a financial services company. Her entire job was investigating and preventing exactly the kind of fraud she'd committed. If I reported her crime to her own compliance department, they would have to investigate her with the same rigor they'd apply to any employee accused of fraud. They couldn't sweep it under the rug or give her preferential treatment without potentially exposing the company to massive regulatory liability. And more importantly, if the investigation confirmed the fraud, which it would because I had all the documentation, they would have to terminate her, immediately, for cause. Because keeping an employee who'd committed fraud would be an unconscionable compliance risk for a regulated financial institution. I drafted a professional email to the chief compliance officer at Meridian Financial Group. His name was Richard Chen, and I'd actually met him once at a company holiday party about 2 years earlier. He was a meticulous, careful man in his 50s who'd spent 15 years working for the Securities and Exchange Commission before moving to the private sector. I knew he would take this seriously. I knew he would follow procedure exactly. I kept the email short, clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. 3 sentences, no more. I am writing to report a potential compliance violation involving one of your employees. The attached documents show a business credit account opened using my personal information without my knowledge or consent. The account was opened by Rebecca Torres, who works in your compliance department. I attached the complete document set, everything Rebecca had sent me, plus my own summary timeline and analysis. The application with my forged information, the authorization forms with my forged signature, the account statements, the email correspondence where she'd admitted what she'd done. Everything. I read the email 5 times to make sure the tone was perfect. Concerned but not angry, factual but not accusatory, serious but not hysterical. Then I scheduled it to send at 6 a.m. the next morning, which was a Thursday. I wanted it to arrive first thing in the morning, before Richard started his day, so it would be sitting at the top of his inbox demanding immediate attention. Then I closed my laptop and went to bed. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. After the email sent on Thursday morning, I checked at 6:01 a.m. to confirm delivery. I said absolutely nothing to Rebecca about what I'd done. I went about my routine exactly as before, maintaining the same patterns and behaviors we'd established over 4 years of marriage. I went to work at my usual time. I came home at my usual time. I made dinner when it was my turn to cook. I asked her about her day over dinner, listening with apparent interest as she talked about a difficult client who was disputing some invoices. I watched TV with her in the evenings. I went to bed at the same time. I maintained the same level of physical affection, the casual touches, the goodnight kiss, the hand-holding when we walked to the subway together in the mornings. I acted like nothing had changed, like everything was fine. Rebecca did the same. In her mind, the issue was completely closed and resolved. She'd explained herself, I'd accepted it, I'd even asked for complete documentation to track the account properly, and now we could move on. The crisis had been averted. The marriage was intact. We were fine. She had absolutely no idea that the walls were closing in, that her professional life was about to detonate in spectacular fashion. I watched her over those next few days with a strange, detached curiosity. It was like watching someone walk unknowingly toward a cliff edge in the fog. You can see the disaster coming. You know exactly what's about to happen, but they're completely oblivious, just walking forward with confidence and purpose. On Thursday evening, she came home excited about a new client she'd landed through a referral. A mid-sized retail company with about 40 employees that needed help restructuring their accounting department and implementing better financial controls. It was a big contract, she said, maybe $30,000 over 6 months, possibly more if they wanted to extend the engagement. This was exactly the kind of client that could really elevate her consulting business, establish her reputation, lead to more referrals. I congratulated her enthusiastically. I asked detailed questions about the scope of work, the timeline, the key deliverables. I acted interested and supportive and proud. Inside, I felt nothing. Just that cold clarity that had settled over me since Tuesday evening. On Friday, she spent most of the evening working on a proposal for the new client, typing away at the kitchen table with that focused intensity she got when she was working on something important. I sat on the couch reading, occasionally glancing up at her, wondering if this would be the last proposal she'd ever write. Part of me felt something then, not quite guilt, but a low, uncomfortable hum in my chest. A distant echo of something that might have been remorse or sympathy or sadness. This was my wife, after all, the person I'd chosen to build a life with, the person who knew how I took my coffee and what movies made me cry and exactly how to make me laugh when I was stressed about work. The person I'd stood next to in that vineyard 4 years ago and promised to love and honor and cherish. And I was about to systematically dismantle her entire professional life. But then I remembered what she'd said on Tuesday evening. I didn't think you'd mind. She didn't think I'd mind that she'd stolen my identity. She didn't think I'd mind that she'd forged my signature. She didn't think I'd mind that she'd committed a federal crime using my name and my credit and my legal identity. She didn't think I'd mind because she didn't think of me as a separate person with rights and boundaries and legal protections. She thought of me as an extension of herself, as a resource to be accessed, as a tool to be used when her own tools proved insufficient. That uncomfortable hum faded pretty quickly after that. It took exactly 3 business days from when my email landed in Richard Chen's inbox. On Monday afternoon, I was in a meeting at work, one of those interminable status updates with the client team for the hospital system project Rebecca had mentioned, when my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced down briefly, keeping my attention mostly on the meeting. Text from Rebecca. Something weird is happening at work. Call me when you can. I didn't call. I finished the meeting, which dragged on for another 45 minutes, and then I went back to my desk and worked through some project documentation that was due by end of day. Normal routine, nothing unusual. She texted again about an hour later. They're investigating something. I don't know what. They called me into a meeting with Richard and HR. I'm freaking out. Please call me. I still didn't respond. I had another meeting scheduled, this one about budget allocation for Q4, and I couldn't exactly step out to handle what was presumably my wife's professional crisis. Also, I wanted to see how this would play out without my interference or input. When I finally got home that evening around 6:30, my normal time, nothing rushed or unusual, Rebecca was already there. She'd come home early, which was unusual for her. She typically worked until 6 at least, sometimes later if there was a deadline or a crisis. I heard her before I saw her. She was on the phone in the bedroom, her voice tight and angry and frightened in a way I'd rarely heard before. I don't know what they're talking about, she was saying, her words coming fast and sharp. There has to be some mistake, some kind of misunderstanding. Can you look into it? Please? I need to know what's happening here. I walked into the bedroom slowly, setting down my messenger bag by the door. She looked up at me, and I was genuinely startled by her appearance. Her face was pale and drawn, almost gray. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She'd been crying, maybe for hours. Her hair was disheveled, pulled back in a messy ponytail that she'd clearly done without looking in a mirror. She was still wearing her work clothes, but they were wrinkled and slightly askew, like she'd been moving around restlessly for hours. She was talking to her father, I realized, Michael Torres, a retired attorney who'd spent 30 years doing corporate law before retiring 3 years ago. He still did occasional consulting work for old clients, mostly just to stay busy. She ended the call after another minute of tense conversation. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I took off my jacket, hanging it carefully on the back of the bedroom door. "What's going on?" "Compliance called me into a meeting this afternoon," she said, her voice shaking now. Richard Chen and 2 people from HR, Jennifer Park, and someone I didn't recognize, maybe from legal. They asked me about a credit account. A business credit line. They said someone filed a formal complaint claiming I opened an account using someone else's information without proper authorization. They showed me documentation. They asked if I recognized it. She stared at me, waiting for me to react, to be surprised, to be concerned, to ask questions. I just looked at her calmly. They put me on paid administrative leave while they investigate, she continued, the words tumbling out faster now. Effective immediately. They made me surrender my building access card and my laptop. They had security escort me out of the building like I'm some kind of criminal. Everyone saw. Everyone watched me being walked out by security. She was breathing hard now, almost hyperventilating. Was it you? She asked finally, the question coming out broken and desperate. Did you report me? Did you file a complaint? I didn't answer immediately. I walked past her to the bathroom, washed my hands thoroughly with soap and hot water, dried them carefully on the hand towel. Normal evening routine. Nothing rushed. Then I walked back out and met her eyes. Yes, I said calmly. The single word hung in the air between us like a physical object. Why? The word came out as almost a whisper, broken and disbelieving. Why would you do that? Because you committed fraud, I said, keeping my voice level and neutral. You used my identity without my permission to open a credit account. That's identity theft under federal law. It's a crime. I reported it to the appropriate authorities. The appropriate, she laughed then, a sharp, bitter, slightly hysterical sound. You reported me to my own company? You knew exactly what would happen. You knew they'd have to investigate me. You knew I could lose my job. You did this deliberately. Yes, I said again. We're married. She was shouting now, her voice cracking with emotion. We're married. We're supposed to be a team. We're supposed to protect each other. That doesn't give you the right to steal my identity, I said calmly. Marriage isn't a license to commit crimes against your spouse. Marriage doesn't override federal law. You're going to ruin my career over this? Tears were streaming down her face now, real tears of rage and fear and disbelief. Over a credit line I was paying off? Over something that didn't even hurt you? Something that was actually helping your credit score? You're really going to destroy me over this? I took a breath, maintaining my composure. I'm not destroying you. I'm protecting myself from being an accessory to fraud. You broke the law. You used my name to do it. What happens next is the consequence of your choices, not mine. I didn't force you to commit identity theft. I didn't force you to forge my signature. Those were your decisions. I thought you loved me, she said, her voice breaking completely now. I did, I said, and I meant it. Past tense. Deliberately. But love doesn't mean I have to let you commit crimes in my name. Love doesn't mean I surrender my legal rights. Love doesn't protect you from consequences. She didn't have a response to that. She just stood there in our bedroom, shaking, tears streaming down her face, mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. She looked destroyed, broken, like her entire world had just collapsed around her. I felt nothing, just that cold, clear certainty that I'd made the right choice. The next 2 weeks were strange. Rebecca stayed in the apartment. Where else would she go? But we barely spoke. She slept in the guest room. She spent most of her time on the phone with her father, with attorneys, with former colleagues. I could hear her through the walls, could hear the desperation in her voice as she tried to understand what was happening, tried to figure out if there was any way to salvage her career. I went to work, I came home, I ordered takeout or made simple dinners. I existed in our shared space like a ghost, present but not engaged. On the 8th day after her suspension, I got a call at work. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, a 646 area code, which was New York City, but not anyone in my contacts. Mr. Torres? The voice was male, professional, careful. This is Richard Chen from Meridian Financial Group. We met briefly at the holiday party a couple years ago. I remember, I said, my pulse quickening slightly despite my efforts to stay calm. I wanted to reach out directly, if you don't mind. I apologize for contacting you at work, but this seemed important enough to warrant the intrusion. There's been a development in our investigation that I thought you should be aware of. I closed my office door, sat down at my desk. What kind of development? There was a pause, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. We've discovered that your wife's fraudulent activity was more extensive than what you initially reported. The credit line she opened using your information wasn't the only account. In the course of our investigation, we've identified at least 3 other instances where she accessed confidential employee data through her position in compliance and used that information for unauthorized purposes. My blood went cold. The office suddenly felt too small, too warm. What do you mean? She opened credit accounts using the identities of at least 3 other Meridian employees. Richard said, his voice grimly professional. Small amounts in each case, nothing that would trigger immediate red flags in credit monitoring. She was extremely careful about it. But once we started digging after your report, once we pulled her access logs and reviewed her activity patterns, we found a clear pattern of unauthorized access to employee records. She'd been doing this for at least 14 months, possibly longer. I couldn't speak for a moment. The implications were staggering. 3 other people. She'd done this to 3 other people. This wasn't just about us. This wasn't just about our marriage. This was systematic, calculated, serial. Who? I finally managed to ask. I can't disclose their names. They're victims in this case, and their privacy is protected. But I can tell you that we've contacted all 3 individuals, and they were completely unaware of the accounts until we reached out. One of them discovered unexplained debt on their credit report only after we contacted them. Another nearly lost a mortgage application because of the unauthorized accounts. The third was facing an internal investigation for undisclosed financial liabilities before we realized what had happened. Richard paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. I wanted you to know because there will be criminal charges filed. This has gone beyond our internal investigation. The FBI is now involved, specifically their Financial Crimes Division. Identity theft at this scale, using a position of trust to access confidential information, this is serious federal crime territory. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York is reviewing the case. After I hung up, I just sat there in my office for probably 20 minutes, staring at my computer screen without seeing anything. My mind was racing, trying to process this new information, trying to understand how Rebecca, my wife, the woman I'd shared a life with for 6 years, could have done this. She hadn't just crossed a line with me, she'd been running a systematic fraud operation for over a year, using her position in compliance, her position of trust, the very job where she was supposed to be preventing exactly this kind of crime, to access confidential employee information and steal identities. And she'd done it so casually, so confidently, with such apparent ease and lack of guilt. I thought about her confession that Tuesday evening. The casual tone, the complete absence of fear or remorse. She'd told me about the fraud like she was describing a household chore because she genuinely didn't think it mattered. She didn't think I'd care because she'd already done it to 3 other people and nothing had happened. No one had noticed. No one had cared. She'd gotten away with it completely. Until me, until I refused to play along, until I decided that being her husband didn't mean being her accomplice. When I got home that evening, Rebecca was in the kitchen making tea. She looked up when I walked in, and for a brief moment our eyes met. She looked haunted, desperate, like someone who knows the walls are closing in but doesn't know how to escape. "The FBI contacted me today," she said quietly. I set down my bag, didn't respond. "They know about the other accounts," she continued, her voice barely audible. "They know everything. They're building a criminal case." "I know," I said. Her eyes widened. "How do you know?" "Richard Chen called me. He told me about the investigation." She stared at me for a long moment, and I watched as understanding dawned across her face. She realized in that moment that I'd known before she did, that I'd been kept informed, that I was considered the victim here, the innocent party, while she was the criminal. "There were others?" I said, making it a question even though I already knew the answer. She looked away. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is." She was quiet for a long time. Then, "They were small amounts, just to bridge cash flow gaps. I always intended to pay them back." "You stole their identities," I said flatly. "You used your position at work to access their confidential information, and then you opened fraudulent credit accounts in their names. That's not borrowing. That's not a cash flow gap. That's organized crime." "Don't say that," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't call me a criminal. What else would you call it?" She didn't have an answer for that. The federal charges were filed in mid-January, about 3 months after my initial report to Meridian. The U.S. Attorney's Office had taken their time building an airtight case, and the charging document was exhaustive. 3 counts of identity theft under 18 U.S.C., paragraph 1028A7. 5 counts of wire fraud under 18 U.S.C., paragraph 1343. 1 count of unauthorized computer access under 18 U.S.C., paragraph 1030A2. 2 counts of aggravated identity theft under 18 U.S.C., paragraph 1028A, and one count of conspiracy to commit fraud, even though she'd worked alone, because the prosecutor wanted maximum sentencing flexibility. Each count carried potential prison time. The mandatory minimum, if convicted on all counts, was 28 months in federal prison. The maximum was over 40 years, though obviously no judge would impose anything close to that for white-collar crime without violence. Rebecca hired an expensive attorney, a guy named Leonard Rothstein, who specialized in federal white-collar defense and had a reputation for getting favorable plea deals. He was probably costing her family about $200,000, maybe more. Her parents mortgaged their house to pay for him. Leonard tried to negotiate a plea deal with the U.S. Attorney's Office. He argued that Rebecca had no prior criminal history, that she'd been under financial stress, that she'd made terrible mistakes but had never intended to cause harm. He offered full restitution, community service, probation, anything to avoid prison time. The prosecutor wasn't interested. This was exactly the kind of case they loved: clear-cut facts, unsympathetic defendant who'd abused a position of trust, strong deterrent value for an industry where this kind of fraud was increasingly common. They wanted to make an example of her. The trial was scheduled for late March. It lasted 6 days. I was called as the government's first witness. I sat in the witness box in the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, raised my right hand, swore to tell the truth, and then spent 2 hours answering questions from the assistant U.S. attorney prosecuting the case. She was a sharp woman in her late 30s named Patricia Morrison, who had a reputation for being thorough and relentless. She walked me through my entire relationship with Rebecca, how we'd met, when we'd married, our financial arrangements, the evening she'd confessed to the fraud. She entered into evidence the email Rebecca had sent me with all the documentation. She had me identify the forged signatures, confirm that I'd never authorized any of the accounts, explain how I'd discovered the scope of the fraud. I was calm throughout. Factual. I didn't editorialize. I didn't express emotion. I just answered the questions precisely and honestly. Leonard Rothstein tried to paint me as vindictive during cross-examination. He asked whether I'd been angry at Rebecca, whether I'd wanted revenge, whether I'd gone to her employer instead of handling it privately because I wanted to destroy her career. I reported a crime, I said simply. That's what citizens are supposed to do when they become aware of criminal activity. I reported it to the entity best positioned to investigate and respond, which was her employer's compliance department. I didn't destroy her career. She destroyed her career when she chose to commit fraud. He pushed harder. But you must have known what would happen when you made that report. You must have known she'd be investigated, probably fired, possibly prosecuted. Yes, I said. I knew those were likely outcomes, just like she knew those were potential consequences when she chose to commit fraud. She works in compliance. She understands the legal framework around identity theft better than most people. She made an informed decision to break the law. I made an informed decision to report it. That seemed to deflate him. He didn't have much else to work with. The other 3 victims testified as well. Their stories were heartbreaking in different ways. Michael Chen was a 26-year-old junior analyst who'd been working at Meridian for just 18 months when Rebecca targeted him. He'd discovered the fraud only after being denied a mortgage application for his first home, something he'd been saving for years to afford. The unexplained debt on his credit report had tanked his score from 740 to 620. It had taken him 8 months and thousands of dollars in legal fees to get the fraudulent accounts removed and his credit restored. He'd lost the house he'd wanted to buy because someone else had made an offer while he was fighting to clear his credit. He testified in a quiet, controlled voice about how the fraud had affected his life, his future plans, his sense of security. His hands shook slightly as he identified the documents showing the account Rebecca had opened using his information. Sarah Williams was a 34-year-old single mother of 2 who worked in Meridian's operations department. Rebecca had accessed her personnel file and used her information to open a credit card with a $15,000 limit. Sarah discovered it only when she started getting calls from debt collectors about missed payments. Payments on an account she hadn't known existed. She'd been terrified that she would lose custody of her children if the debt collectors garnished her wages or if she had to file for bankruptcy. She cried on the witness stand as she described the months of stress and fear, the sleepless nights, the constant worry that she was somehow responsible even though she'd done nothing wrong. David Okonkwo was a 41-year-old senior manager who'd been with Meridian for almost a decade. He'd nearly lost his job when the company's annual financial disclosure review had flagged undisclosed business credit lines in his name, lines he knew absolutely nothing about. He'd been placed on suspension while the company investigated whether he'd failed to disclose a conflict of interest or outside business activity. His reputation had been damaged. His career trajectory had stalled. Colleagues who'd once respected him now viewed him with suspicion. He testified with quiet anger about the professional damage, the stain on his reputation that might never fully wash away. All three of them identified Rebecca in court. All three confirmed they'd never authorized her to use their information. All three confirmed they'd never even discussed financial matters with her. Rebecca's defense was weak. Leonard put her on the stand. A risky move, but he probably felt he had no choice given how damaging the evidence was. She cried. She apologized repeatedly. She claimed she'd been under extreme financial stress because her freelance business had been struggling and she'd been trying to help her parents with medical bills from her mother's cancer treatment. None of that was true, by the way. Her freelance business had been thriving. Her mother didn't have cancer. These were lies constructed to generate sympathy. The prosecutor tore her apart on cross-examination. Patricia Morrison methodically walked through every false statement Rebecca had made, every inconsistency in her story, every piece of evidence that contradicted her claims of financial desperation. She showed bank statements proving Rebecca had been spending money on luxury items, designer handbags, expensive dinners, a weekend trip to Miami, while supposedly being so financially desperate that she had to commit fraud. It was brutal to watch. By the time Patricia was finished, Rebecca's credibility was completely destroyed. The jury deliberated for 6 hours over 2 days. When they came back with the verdict, the courtroom was packed. Victims, media, Meridian employees who'd come to watch their former colleague face justice, guilty on all counts. Rebecca's mother sobbed in the gallery. Her father sat stone-faced, his hands clenched in his lap. Leonard Rothstein put his hand on Rebecca's shoulder as she slumped in her chair. I sat in the back row, watching it all with that same cold detachment I'd felt since that Tuesday evening in September. The sentencing hearing was 3 weeks later. The victims gave impact statements. Federal sentencing guidelines called for something in the range of 37 to 46 months, with adjustments for the abuse of a position of trust and the number of victims. The judge, a stern woman in her early 60s named Margaret Fontaine, who'd been on the federal bench for 20 years, listened to all the arguments. Then she delivered her sentence: 42 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release after prison, full restitution to all victims. The total came to about $270,000, including interest, fees, penalties, and compensation for the victim's time and legal expenses. Rebecca was also ordered to pay a $50,000 fine. She'd serve her time at FCI Danbury, a minimum security federal prison for women in Connecticut, about 90 miles north of the city. They took her into custody immediately. She looked back once as the marshals led her out of the courtroom, her eyes finding mine in the gallery. I looked away.